Welcome everyone to our webinar on climate careers in international organizations. It's fantastic to have you all here. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be sent to everyone who has registered after the webinar is over. We'll send that in the next couple of days. And to ask questions, please use the Q&A feature. Once a question has appeared in the Q&A feature, you can add a thumbs up if you want someone else's question to be answered. And the more thumbs up that we see, the more likely that that question will be asked during the Q&A. So panelists, I'd love to see you. If you could turn your screens on, your videos on, and we'll bring you up on stage, so to speak, so that we can have a little introduction of everyone who is going to be presenting today. So first, hello to Sophie, who's going to show up just in a moment. Sophie is currently working for 350.org and has previously worked for WWF and UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. And we're happy to announce that she's starting in January at UNESCO. So congratulations to Sophie for this new position. And one thing that I think is really interesting about Sophie is that she's a native French speaker operating in English-speaking environment. Thank you for being here, Sophie.
Thank you, and hi, everyone.
And next, I'd like to introduce Niki. Niki is a climate advocacy specialist at UNEP, the UN Environment Program, and she's a former UN volunteer. And one thing that I think is really interesting about Niki is her experience first interning before joining her positions that she has now. So I'm interested to hear more about that later. Thanks for being here, Niki.
Thanks for the opportunity. Hi.
And Brent, I'd like to introduce you next. So Brent is a really dynamic person, having worked for a number of different organizations. And in particular, he worked for 3 executive secretaries of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. And he was a speechwriter and advisor for 3 executive secretaries. That's fantastic. Today, he owns Global Speechwriter, a firm supporting global leaders who struggle to develop effective communications around climate change, sustainability, and the environment. Brent, your background is so interesting. It speaks for itself. Thank you so much for being here.
Tammy, great to be here. And to all the panelists and everybody attending, hi.
Great. Next, I'd like to introduce Rune. And he is the inspiration for this event. In fact, he came to me a couple of months ago and said, I've got all these people coming to me. I'd really like to help them with their job search and encourage them. There are too many people. How can we work together? Let's do a webinar. And I was like, yes, that's fantastic. Let's do a webinar. So thank you so much, Rune, for creating this webinar, bringing it to me to help get it off the ground. I really appreciate it. And just to introduce the man of the hour, he previously worked for UNEP, the UN Environment Program, and now is an independent climate communicator. He's written a book called Speaking on Climate. It's a guide for activist speech writing, which I am really excited to read, and it's coming out next year. So thank you so much for being here, Rune.
Thank you so much, and what an introduction. And I'm delighted to be here with this exquisite panel, and so looking forward to hearing what all the participants have of questions and thoughts. Thank you.
And that's a perfect segue. Thank you so much. We're actually going to launch a quick poll because the panelists would like to know what you think and what you need from this experience. So I will start that right now, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about it. And as I talk about it, I'm going to end the spotlighting for the different speakers, and then we'll come back to the speakers in just a moment. So the poll has just been launched. Panelists cannot see it, but everyone in the room can see these 4 questions. So the questions are, which of the two topics, number one, which of the two topics that we have planned for you today are most interesting? What do you most want to hear about? Is it more climate communications in the international context, or is it more the hiring process in these international spaces? So please let us know which of those two topics is most valuable to you. And the second question is, what types of jobs are most interesting to you? So it might be working for a specific kind of organization like in the UN system, or it might be working internationally in other types of organizations outside of the UN system, or both. Are you interested in communications jobs related to climate change or the ecological and green transition? Let us know. This will help us orient our answers to your questions. The third question is about the types of help you need when you're looking at your career and your job search. So these might not all be answered today, but it does give us an idea of what future programming might be useful and what we can do to help you launch your career and have the greatest success. And then the last question is pretty important for us to know. So how much work experience do you have? If a lot of the people in the room are just coming right out of college, well, we can reorient our questions to that group. If the majority have more than 11 years of experience, well, we'll readjust our answers to that group. If there's quite a variety, we're going to try to have different types of answers for the different groups that are in the room. All right, so those are the 4 questions. We've got 83 of 123 people having responded. That's fantastic. Thanks so much. I'm going to close the survey in 30 seconds. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time here to finish up answering the survey so that we can really get an idea of who's in the room and cater our answers to your profiles. All right, so time is up. I'm going to end the poll now, and I'm going to show everyone so everyone can see the results of this poll. What we've got is a 57% of you are interested in the first topic and 61% in the second topic on hiring practices. So that's great. Sounds like there's quite a solid mix and interest in both of those sessions. And the types of jobs, there's quite a lot of people who are interested in climate. So that's the number 1 that came out first, climate and the ecological transition. Number 2 is working for the UN system. Number 3 is the non-UN international environment. And number 4 is jobs and communication. Thanks so much. That's really helpful. We can definitely cater our responses to the climate context and the international context as a priority. And there's last 2 questions. A lot of you are interested in networking to get a job. We're going to talk a lot about that today. How to get a job in the climate sector. Those are the top 2 responses. Thanks so much for that. And we're going to talk about those 2 today. So that's fantastic. And in terms of work experience, there's quite a variety. A lot of people over 11 years of experience, and then a number of people in that 1 to 5 years experience. Perfect. We'll have a variety of answers that cater to the different groups of people who are in the room. I'm so sorry. I ended the poll and I didn't share the results. Excuse me for that. I needed to press the button one more time. So now everyone can actually see the results. I'll let you visualize them. I've just shared them, but verbally, but I do want you to be able to see them briefly. So I'll leave them up for just a moment and then we'll get started with the panel. And panelists, could you give me a thumbs up? I can see you on my screen if you feel like you have the information you need from the poll. I don't want to close it too soon. All right, looking good. So I'm going to stop sharing the poll results now. Thank you so much to everyone who filled out the survey. Really appreciate it. And I think our panelists are going to really get a lot out of that so that they can cater their answers to your needs. All right, let's get started. So we're going to have Niki come up and talk to us to kick off the conversation about what it is like to have a climate communications job in the international context. So, Niki, to start off with, how would you describe the climate communications role that you have in the international context?
Thank you, Tammy, for this question, and again for the opportunity to be here. So I would describe the role as well, it's an exciting role because the potential is huge. And I guess that the role focuses on I work at the UN Environment Program currently as an advocacy specialist for climate. And what we aim to do is to disseminate the science so that because that is still important. There are still many deniers out there. So we have to make sure that the science is reliable and ensure that the UN and UNEP is maintained as a reliable source, and make sure that that science is accessible. We also to all audiences, because we're working at an international organization, so we need to ensure that what we're communicating is culturally sensitive, and so we tend to be factual. And then we also have regional specific channels. So on those channels, we can be more specific. We also try not to be doom and gloom and communicate the solutions, because they exist, and we find that that's the best way to inspire change. And we try to focus on making it as accessible and interesting as possible, so that our audiences can engage. And our audiences include the general public, policymakers, NGOs. It's a big range of audiences. So depending on the channel, we focus our efforts in different ways.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing all of that. You mentioned so many really valuable things about the cultural sensitivities that need to be taken into consideration, and the adapting the message to the different regions. That's so critically important. And I really love that you mentioned solutions as a priority versus the doom and gloom, because climate psychology says that solutions work much better than doom and gloom. So thanks so much for bringing that up here. And so if you could name very briefly one thing that you really appreciate about working in climate communications at the international level, what would it be?
I really appreciate the potential impact, and also working at the international level. Um, is like climate change is a transboundary issue and requires collaborative efforts across nations worldwide. And being in a space where we have the um, authority to speak on the issue to this wide range of audiences is really exciting. That's what I really appreciate in this role.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Niki. Now I'd like to ask
Thank
a
you.
question from Rune, and we'll come back to Niki later for some more questions. So I'd like to find out from Rune, many people who work on climate topics have a lot of passion and a sense of urgency to act, right? And this passion can sometimes be a challenge in the international context. Could you talk a little bit about balancing your passion with the professional expectations of the UN environment?
Of course, I think that's such an important question, because a lot of people who want to enter into the climate sector, climate space, sorry, they do that because they are passionate about climate and our future. And it's a difficult role to be in that space and really have a burning passion to change something, because you are part of a huge organization in the UN, a huge family, huge, so many hierarchies and bureaucracies and procedures and people who decide so much more than you do. And it's a very difficult thing to actually live out that passion of what you want to do. I totally agree with Niki that is what really is what I appreciate the most. It doesn't get much better than when you've developed a product and it comes out from an official UN channel, and you see just it has an immense global impact. That's when you smile and you sit back and, okay, it was worth it. But there are struggles because the direction might not be what you agree with. The pace might not be what you agree with. It rarely is. Things happen slowly. And there are so many leadership levels that needs to be addressed at the same time, and that you need to work your way towards. That said, even we all have a bias from the country that we live and we have lived in. And when you work in a global environment, there are so many cultural contexts that you need to be able to maneuver in, you know. For instance, me living in Denmark, I'm used to democracy and participation really being, that's how we influence climate change and make a difference. But not all countries have that opportunity. So there are so many sensitivities that you need to have. And that's hard when you really just want to, you know, run fast and make an impact and really create the change that you know is there and needs to happen.
Thanks so much. I think that's going to be really helpful for everyone who is really thinking strongly about a career in the climate space. This is a critical question to consider when entering into that international environment. Thanks so much, Rune. So I'd love to ask a question of Sophie now. Okay, I'm going to switch around. And the idea now is to think about what it's like to be in these international spaces as a non-native English speaker, right? So Sophie, you are a native French speaker working in the international space. And so I think your perspective is going to be really valuable to people who come from all over the world. We know that registrants have come from almost every continent, and they speak many different languages. So from your point of view, what advice do you have about working in communications in English when English is not your mother tongue?
Thanks, Tammy. And yeah, I think this is a really interesting question because I know it can be very daunting trying to work in communications when it's not your first language. But there's three things I'd like to say. So my first point is that especially when you're at the beginning of your career, just don't be afraid to ask a native speaker to proofread an important document or an email. I have relied loads on friendly colleagues in my first English job, and people are always happy to help as long as you approach them in the right time. In my first job in English, I used to find writing simple emails quite difficult at the start. It felt like you had to learn a whole new vocabulary to be able to convey the nuances and to be able to appear professional. But the more you rely on colleagues to help at the beginning, and then the more you read and write emails, the more you're able to mimic really the codes of this kind of communication. So it will get better. Same with presentations, I would say. The more you rehearse, the more you get better. And I still rehearse presentations like at least 3 times before I feel comfortable going for it. My second point, and really I'd say what I really want to convey here, is that I have come to realize that actually being a non-native speaker in an international context can be an advantage. And that's because, and I guess just like this, the audience, the people here in this webinar, most of your audience will be also non-native speakers. They will have English as a second language. So that means that you, as a non-native speaker, you understand this audience much better, frankly, than native speakers. And I've been in situations where, we were groups of non-native speakers would struggle to understand what the native speakers would say. And that's often because not all native English speakers, but some native English speakers, sometimes forget really who they're speaking to. And so are going to use idioms and expressions and cultural references that are not necessarily widely shared. So I would say, always keep that in mind and think that if something is not clear to you, it's probably not clear to a huge chunk of your audience. And that sort of brings me to my third point, which is that you can turn this into your advantage and really rely on your strengths. So me, when I have to write a piece in a professional context, I don't try and write in a creative way. I know that's not my strength. So I'm not going to try and use like fancy expressions or like flowery language just because it makes you sound a bit more like sophisticated or whatever. I'm going to focus on being clear, concise, and as accessible as possible. And I do think that that's a writing style that is very useful to have, especially in climate communications, which, as Niki was saying, a lot of the communications happens to be factual because it's a lot about breaking down very complicated science, very technical topics, and trying to make it accessible and understandable to a wider audience. And I have found that not being a native English speaker has really helped me turn this into my strength. And if I have a piece in mind that I think would benefit from more creative writing, I might suggest it to a native colleague, a native speaking colleague, or I might enlist their help to do it. I won't try and do it by myself because I know that's not my strength. I think that's also just a slight digression. That's also the case with jargon. Always try and limit jargon and acronyms to really make what you're writing as accessible as possible.
I really like what you said about trusting yourself, because when you're a non-native English speaker in an environment where the language, you may already have questions, you may already feel a little bit of the imposter syndrome of, oh gosh, can I really be in this environment? And in fact, you should trust yourself and say, if it's not clear to me, lots of people are going to have trouble with it. And so this is a really important takeaway that I think that everyone should really grab onto and notice that it's a strength, really, to be able to recognize these moments when the native English speakers are saying things that are not super clear and could be written in a much more accessible way. Great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Sophie. I really appreciate it. I'd love to ask a question of Brent now. Brent,
Sure.
You've worked for 3 executive secretaries for the UNFCCC. Can you tell us about the realities, without, depressing us, but can you tell us about the realities of working for an international organization that people might not know about, things that they need to know before joining?
Sure. Well, Tammy, let's start with a little bit of the good, a little bit of the bad. Let's have a little bit of a balance. So I'll try and provide that the best I can. I think when we're looking at advantages of working in an international organization, one of the best things is that it really does improve and widens your worldview. I mean, look, I'm Canadian. Living in Canada, the realities of life there, what we think is difficulty, whatever we think is hard, it's nothing compared to some of the people that I've worked with, some of the things that they've gone through. And so it teaches you, it gets you out of yourself. It gives you this broader perspective, and that's helpful. The other thing, if we're looking at this from a networking and a careers approach, moving to an organization such as the UN, where you're in touch with not only other UN functionaries and other people, you are also in touch with NGOs. You're also in touch with private industries as well. So it's also widening your net, setting you up for the future a little bit better as well. In the UN, especially as communicators, or whether you're in NATO, another international organization, whatever, as a communicator, you automatically, in some senses, are working with people that are close to making the big decisions in the organization. You might be working with the executive director, the executive secretary, whomever it is. I was a speechwriter for a number of years, and right away, you're working with people who make the decisions. And that's, I think Rune said it's an incredibly rewarding part of the job. Now, let's talk difficulties, because there are some difficulties, and I'm not trying to scare people off, but these are things that I think are important to think about. The first one is that it's really not a utopia. Okay, if you're at home, if you're in your municipality, you're in your village, and you're looking at a UN job and you're thinking, wow, everything looks like cake over there. Everything looks easy. This is not going to be a problem. Well, let me tell you, let me burst that bubble right away, because that's not the case. The same office politics that exists in your village council are the politics that you're going to face in a UN organization or whatever international organization that there are. Those things don't change. People are people. In fact, you're going to be doing it in a country or in an organization with a number of different people from different countries, different languages, different cultural backgrounds as well. It messes with personal relationships. That's the other thing people don't think about, I think. And so if you have a partner now, you're thinking of applying to a job. Now, is that partner going to come with you? Have you talked about that? What's the case? I know that people suffer from these things in these organizations. So it's good to know these things going into even the application process, even thinking about it. What about loved ones? You may not get back to family quite as often. Look at what happened during COVID. Are you ready for that situation? Finances, that's another challenge that people face. Taxes. I was so naive when I left Canada. I got penalized for things I didn't even know existed. So, for example, withholding tax, do you know about that? Residency, that matters tax-wise. Is there a taxation agreement between the country you're in and the country you're going to? Think about those things. And just one more thing, two more things, actually, Tammy, I want to mention. Health. Health is a big one. If you have special needs, especially if you have issues related to mental health, do you have the resources where you're going that you need? Make sure you're focusing on those things. The UN does a pretty good job dealing with mental health and other issues, but know what's there. And then finally, the big one, workload and stress. Don't believe what you see on TV. A lot of the reports are that the UN is this place where a lot of people sit around and just think, and gaze into the distance and that sort of thing, which is BS, of course. I wrote over 1,000 speeches in 5 years. The workload is incredible. It's intense. Of course, it's a little more in some organizations than others, but don't think that this is a cushy job that you're getting into, because it's not. So lots to think about there. Happy to talk about some of the bureaucratic stuff, maybe another question.
Love it. Thank you so much for jumping into all of these really important issues that, of course, you can't go into all of the details right this moment in this brief webinar, but you really touched on so many critical elements that people need to take very seriously before they consider one of these international jobs, especially if they're going to be leaving their country, really taking their family, their life, their whole world to a different place. There are so many different elements to consider. So thank you very much for bringing that up. So what I'd like to do now is create a group discussion. We're going to sort of jump into that first topic to get everyone's thoughts on the variety of questions we have coming up next. So the first question I have for you is that, the people in the audience come from all over the world in places without a UN office or an international organization nearby. So how can their local experience or their knowledge be an advantage within the international space? And I'd love to hear from like one or two of you. Does anyone from the panel want to particularly answer that one? Rune, go for it.
Well, it's pretty much like the language side. When you have English, and you're not a native English speaker, you have another language, and that's a big issue. That's the big skill to have. But it's also, I worked remotely for UNEP. So even though I worked with Niki for a year and a half, I didn't ever get to give her a hug, which is lacking anyway. But that means that I'm pretty in tune with the Danish context, also with the European Union context. So when for instance, the executive director is having media interviews or the like in a context, for instance, in Denmark, then I could help. I could help translate material that others couldn't. I could help because I knew what were the issues, what were the likely questions they were gonna get, what were the pitfalls they were supposed to navigate around. Those issues are really important. And also to see where is the climate debate in that particular. What are the issues that's gonna cause trouble in a moment, that's gonna create an uproar.
Great, thanks. Does anyone want to jump in and build on what Rune has just said about keeping the advantage in the local context, or using the local context that you have as an advantage in the international space? Niki, yeah. And then we'll jump to another question.
Sure. I was just thinking about how, like when we have campaigns, not just on climate, but on anything, like for World Environment Day, we do tend to consult like the entire team so that you can share, how the specific campaign and the call to action would resonate, with people in your country, with audiences in the different countries, and what things that sensitivities you may have overlooked. And I do agree with Rune fully about also making sure that all within the local context, having that skill of another language is really important. We try at the UN to push out all our materials in all UN languages, plus additional ones, so that it can reach wider audiences. So I think that's really helpful. Thanks.
Thanks for adding that, Niki. And I want to encourage all of the people watching this webinar to add their questions in the Q&A. I know we already have some questions there, but I wanted to really remind you that that option is available. We will be answering those questions that are in the Q&A, depending on if it's more associated with the first topic or the second topic. So those questions will be asked at the right moment of this webinar. So the next question I have is about the culture of these United Nations offices. So could you talk a little bit about how new hires can manage the cultural differences between their home country and a place such as the UN? I'd love to hear from a couple of people on the panel. Does anyone in particular want to talk about these differences? Brent, go for it.
Sure, sounds good. This is a really interesting one for me. Again, coming from Canada and sort of being thrown into it, so to speak. I think that we approach this almost surgically sometimes when we talk about cultural differences. Yes, it's important, but we're all people. We need to be curious about each other. We need to just be real with each other. I think that's very important. I think some of us have this attitude where we show up in an organization. It's like being an alien on another planet. We show up, it's like, take me to your leader or tell me about your culture, right? It's not like that. A lot of this stuff happens by having conversations outside of work. Lunches are a big deal. Having lunch with a group of people, not the same group of people all the time. Doing things after work, very, very helpful. You know, we have had some of our best discussions, at least in the organizations I've worked at, going skating after work, ice skating, or going to the Christmas market here in Bonn, things like that. These are really important. Don't overthink it. Be curious. Rely on what got you to the UN in the first place, or why you want to join the UN. You should be genuinely curious about other people and about where they come from and some of their struggles. And also, you have to do the same for other people. You have to show that vulnerability. You know, share a bit about yourself. What was your background like? And sharing some of those things will help other people open up. And I think a lot of that really goes a long way. And if I could just add one more example where I think the UN could actually do a better job of this, promoting this, because in the formal process, I remember at COP23, I think it was, they had something called the Talanoa Dialogue. Fiji was the presidency for this event, for COP23. And what they had was, it was basically a storytelling event where people shared when they were talking about some of the challenges they had or some of the negotiations blockages. This was an area where they could come in and tell stories and share from their perspectives how they would overcome it. I think a lot of people were they weren't sure how this was going to work, but in the end, it worked really well. And it shows just what the power of culture and understanding each other really does.
Thanks so much. Sophie, I think you wanted to mention something?
Yeah, just a couple of things to add to what Brent said. I think firstly, at a time where a lot of us are working remotely, I've found that having these little moments, a good way to have these little informal moments where logging in a bit early to meetings. You log in 5 minutes early, and then there might be no one, but there might be a couple of people, and this is your moment to have a bit of an informal chat. And there's not unfortunately, when you're working remotely, there's not that many other spaces to get that going. So that's a nice way to get some of that, let's say. And I also wanted to say that I think when you have your first UN job, it's just daunting how much there is to learn. Like the learning curve is steep and is scary. And everybody goes through this. And it took me like 6 months to just sort of wrap my head around what was happening. And again, there you can rely on sort of, friendly colleagues or things like this. But I just want to provide a bit of reassurance that it's normal, it's the process, and you will get there, even though it's daunting.
Thanks so much. Brent and Sophie, you answered really eloquently. Thank you very much for sharing your perspective on, how can we adapt ourselves or learn about other cultures and build those relationships while in person or online. I really appreciate that. Thank you. So before we answer the very interesting and very specific questions that are coming in the Q&A, I have one more question that's for everyone. I think I'd love to hear from Rune on this one, but if anyone else wants to jump in on the panel, I'd love to hear. So I'm curious about the importance you find in adapting our communications methods and approaches for the unique context of the green transition and climate change. So this is very much for anyone working in climate change, whether you're a communicator or not. The question really is is about the skill of communicating, and whether you think that a training would be valuable as like on their CV. What do you think about that, Rune?
I definitely think training is important. I do believe that climate communication is somewhat different. It's still the same. If it's good communication, it's good communication. But there are certain aspects that put climate communication a bit differently, I believe. And one of the things is actually when Brent is talking about we have to be human and authentic and vulnerable, that definitely goes twice for climate communication, because so many people have climate anxiety in different degrees, are having their homes broken and destroyed and flooded and crops lost. And if we just keep on communicating in this objective science voice, then that just doesn't engage anybody, doesn't really help the people who needs to be heard. So there is a shift in communication style that needs to happen if you really want to be a good climate communicator. I know Brent has worked on this in speech writing as well. It needs to be personal. It needs to be emotional, authentic, human, and that's hard. So that's the external side, and you can definitely get training on that. One climate action is a good place to go. I know Brent has some speech writing lessons that's probably going up soon. And it also goes the other way, that when you're engaged in climate and you're working in an international environment, do seek out the support systems that you do have access to, which I wanted to add to that before, because if you want to work remotely, that's hard. That's very hard to be sitting there with tons of tasks, massive passion, and very little access to support systems. So reach out, find support, reach out to good colleagues, check in, do whatever you can, but it is hard in the remote context. So just, cut into the chase. Yes, do seek out training to make sure that you are as sharp as you can get on the climate issue. There are certain specifics, I think.
Okay. Does anyone else want to jump in on that? I have other questions I could ask as well. No? All right. So the next, I want to ask a question from Mark Tegub. It's about narrative and messaging, right? And so he's wondering, is there a single narrative or messaging approach that climate communication professionals adhere to or should adhere to? It's kind of a yes or no question there. And there's a follow-up one as well that Mark has asked. Brent, go for it.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I believe it was Mark. Yes, is there a one narrative? Well, not necessarily. I know that and I'm just speaking now from the UNFCCC point of view and from the period that I was there. I remember we would do, I think, 2 main messaging updates, narrative updates in the year. That changed to quarterly, and then that changed almost month by month. And in fact, I would recommend, especially with how quickly things are changing, that there is no one set of messages that you stick to. I think that you want 2 or 3 main ones at the beginning of the year that you want to establish. Like these are the things that we really want to get across this year. But when you're looking issue by issue, you have to be so nimble and make sure that you're changing them. I remember, in fact, we had some messages going up for approval. Those messages hadn't been approved yet. And by the way, this is not a UN thing. This also happened in the government of Canada. They were still being approved and more messages were needed. So, they were changing as we were even approving those messages. So the shorter answer is no.
Great, thanks. And there's a follow-up here to Mark's question, and I'd like to actually jump in on this as well. The follow-up question is, how can we align the global climate message with various national agendas and the distinct priorities of different stakeholders? So the different mandates of different UN agencies, different international organizations like REN 21. And I want to tell a story about this. So REN 21, I used to work there. It's a renewable energy policy network promoting renewable energy in many different countries around the world. And whenever we put out a press release, we would end up creating, yes, an international message for sure, but we also created specific press releases for countries. So we'd had one for France, for example, because we're based in France. We had one in Germany because we had a lot of funding from Germany and support in Germany. We had one in the US. And so we would actually create a very highly tailored press release for each of the 10 priority countries that we wanted to target that particular year. And this helped us create messages for that audience. We were looking at the statistics for each of those countries to tell a story, to make it real and emotional and tangible for the people on the ground. And that enabled the journalists to pick up the story more easily because it was more relatable. So this is just my answer to your question. I think it's really important to not simply go by an international message, but adapt the message to the audience. And the more you can break that down into subcultures and subgroups and regions, the better reception your message is going to have. So I'd love to hear what others might have to say to answer this question. Sophie, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I wanted to add to your point as well is that tailoring the message based on your audience, but I think it's also useful to remember what's the role of your organization in the climate movement and in the climate sphere. So what's going to be your niche, your added value, and this can help really frame your message. So Tammy, when you were working at REN 21, it was renewable energy. So that was sort of like the overarching framing for all of your messaging. And with climate, it's such a huge, vast, interconnected and complex issue that it's easy to get lost in the intricacies of it all. But I think always remembering what is your organization purpose in the climate sphere is useful to really hone a message that will make sense to your audience.
Thank you so much, Sophie. That's really helpful. I see Rune wants to say something, and I want to also mention, maybe Rune, you can mention this in your answer as well. Is there room for humor? It's another question that came in on communications, and then I'd like to switch to a different topic because not everyone here is here for communications. So Rune, go ahead, and then we'll jump to another topic.
Cool. I definitely agree that there is a need for a global narrative, but it needs to be broken down. And that's one of the big burdens of working in communication in a global context, that you can never break it down enough. It's not enough to break it down on continent. It's not enough on countries. It's not enough on municipalities. It's not enough on gender, age, profession. You can always break it more down, and it'll always be better if it was broken down a little bit more. And that really comes down to one thing that inspired me a lot a couple of years ago when the European Climate Foundation was speaking, they said that they had changed their strategy from explaining to people that climate was the most important thing to asking people what is the most important thing and explaining why climate was essential to that. And that's really the movement I think we need to make, to listen much more than we're talking and put it in there. And that brings us to the aspect of humor. Humor has a huge role to play. It can't be that whenever we hear the word climate, we get depressed. That simply cannot be the right thing to do. We need to be able to, especially as passionate climate people, we need to be able to make a little fun of ourselves at times. We need to build that bridge, that human bridge through humor. But we also need to be very careful not to make fun of the people actually suffering from climate and the impacts of climate. And that can be a tricky one at times. Definitely.
Thanks so much. All right. Oh, Brent, go ahead. Yeah.
One more point. I'll keep it short. I agree with you, Ruud. I think, yes, don't want to be making fun of the people that are being impacted, of course, but also let's be careful of the people we're making fun of, period. I'm not necessarily sure making fun of is the best way to put it necessarily, but especially climate deniers, for example. Making fun of them is not necessarily the way to get them on board, right? I'm not sure exactly what the right way is because I would have done that by now. But you know, we do our part to try and use facts, but do it in a storytelling fashion. All of those things. But look, we have to be a little bit careful with it. But I would agree. Let's use humor when we can. This is tough stuff we're dealing with, and it also engages people. Look at The Daily Show. Look at these other groups that are doing it well. Thanks for letting me get that point in. Thank you.
Sure. And it's really important that you mention these shows that are based on humor. I think certain messengers can use humor better than other messengers. And so there's a real need to be careful about using humor for both this messenger. Are you the right messenger for that piece of humor? And also culturally, sometimes humor doesn't translate very well. And so you can upset people unknowingly. So there are some ways that you might want to consider going easy on the humor if you're not the right messenger, or if it might get translated poorly by your audience. So I've got some questions that are on a different wavelength. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. So Katya is asking, to what extent do you feel personally fulfilled and valued in such large organizations? This is a tricky question. These are really big organizations. So, and I've put the question in the chat to the panelists so they can see that the chat is not available to any of the participants, but the panelists can see it on their side. The Q&A is the spot for all of our guests to ask their questions. So I'd love to hear from the panelists. To what extent do you feel personally fulfilled and valued in these organizations? Sophie, go ahead.
Thanks for this question, and it's a tricky one. I think it's helpful to acknowledge that working in such large organization on a topic so difficult as climate change can be, it is hard, it is difficult, and there have been moments where I have been demotivated, sorry. I think what's helped me in these moments is to also focus on achievable wins. And that can be everything and anything. It can be you just managing to finish a project that you really believe in. It can be you managing to just advance in your career in the way you want to. It can be you managing to push some boundaries or things like this. But I think it can be so daunting that just focusing on, little by little, celebrating the small wins is really useful. The second point is also having a group of colleagues that you can really share and vent the frustrations. It is really helpful. And obviously you don't want to be trapped in the cycle of negativity. Like I would say, steer clear from these colleagues. But it's good to just be able to share the sort of like day-to-day absurdities of these jobs sometimes and day-to-day frustrations. So, even remotely, just find your people, get a WhatsApp group going, and that's a nice way to connect and to make the job easier.
Thanks so much. Does anyone else want to add to this daunting question? Rune.
Just very fast. There was a difference in being personally fulfilled in regards to, the work you put out, the impact you have, and, the recognition you get. And recognition is a hard one in an international organization. You can feel small. The recognition that your leaders might offer might not be what you are used to getting. So that might be something that's hard. I at the end of my tenure in UNEP, I started focusing on what I called legacy. What was the footprint that I wanted to be able to say that I had made? And that helped in prioritizing and feeling that something got done, because a lot of things were getting done, but they were not visible. I was part of a much larger organization. So that helped a little, thinking in terms of footprint or legacy.
Thank you. Thanks so much. All right, so the next question I have for you is a broader question around the amount of information that climate communicators have to digest. So how do you do this well? And how do you get on top of different topics? Everyone's nodding their heads. There's a lot of information that's coming at us every single day. The IPCC reports change every year. There's new recommendations, there's new data, there's new technologies, there's advances, and then we discover that it's not really an advance in a certain technology a couple months later. And so how do you deal with the variety of information and the quantity that's coming at you? Sophie, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, thank you. That is a very good question. And I'll start by saying that I think you have to accept that you can't know it all. It is such a complicated topic. And so based on this, I think it's really useful to prioritize depending on what you're most interested in. Is it the intersection between gender and climate? Is it biodiversity and climate? Whatever it is, really cultivate that interest. I have notes. I have like always 100 tabs open on my laptop. And when I see a good number, or when I either screenshot it or add it in my notes, and it's very messy, but once in a while I go through it and I'm like, oh yeah, that's interesting, I can use this. So when you see something, screenshot it or like make a note of it. But I would say, yeah, don't try and become an expert in everything. Some of you might be climate scientists, but most of you probably aren't. And so just prioritize depending on your interest or the priorities of your organizations, the priorities of your team. And if you can master that already, you'll be in a very, very good spot.
Thanks so much. Brent, go ahead.
That was a great answer, Sophie. I really like that. For me, it's always the answer to many things with respect to an international organization job is relationships. As a speechwriter, I would get this question all the time. How do you write a speech on climate finance? You get all this information at once. How do you know what to write about? Well, the simple fact and the dirty secret of speech writing is, of course, we don't know. We're generalists. We're great generalists. And when I say relationships, I mean that I rely on my team members and team members within the organization to get me the information that I need. Not only the information that I need, but stuff I can actually use and phrased in a way that helps me get it into that speech quickly and efficiently. And if you're making people upset, if you're treating people badly, you're not going to get that information. They're going to do a very good job of keeping that information back. Never happened to me, of course, but no, I mean, we all run into these things in our jobs. So make sure you're keeping good relationships with the different groups that you're working with. On a purely logistical note, I use Evernote. There are many, many different note-taking ways to organize. I use that because I can tag stories. I forget things the very next day. I mean, that's also part of speechwriting. I think Rune could also attest to this. You forget everything the next day, so you have to make sure you're labeling things well so that you can get back to them. Those are the few of the things I would recommend.
Oh, you're muted.
Thank you so much for saying that, Niki. I appreciate it. So The follow-up question to this has to do with your experience dealing with misinformation, right? So people are going to come to you and they're going to, or comment on a post, or there might be a colleague, they've read something that's incorrect. How do you deal with that as a communicator, particularly when it's on social media and it's in a public space? Niki, go ahead.
Thanks. So like I said at the beginning, we before we post, we have to make sure that the information is correct, and verified. And we try to ensure that we, like Sophie and Brent said, we have a system to make sure we know where the source of this information has come from, so that when this case arises, we're able to defend it and just lay down where that so to respond factually, and also acknowledge any concerns, and then explain why we've said what we've said and how it fits with the wider climate debate. So that's how we usually handle it. But mis and disinformation is a big challenge for the UN to tackle, and we don't have the resources that some companies may have in their mis and disinformation campaigns for their various agendas. So I wanted to say this before, but I missed the opportunity, that it would be great to also give that training on climate and climate communications to wider audiences outside of the UN bubble, to help be advocates for change, and also get them to comment on forums which the international organizations are not on, and empower them with the science and also the skills for communicating about climate change. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So I see your hand, Brun, and we're coming up on our break time, where we're going to switch to we're going to have a 5-minute break, and we're going to switch to our next topic. Brun, do you want to have the last word before we jump into that?
I will. I think that'll fit nicely. I think Niki spoke eloquently about what the UN is doing in terms of misinformation and fake news and stuff like that. And that's big in climate. But we also need to avoid the pitfall of making this an aspect of who has the right number, because that's not what determines where we're going. We need to address the, we need to, it's not about where the graph is going. If we all know that it should go down, it's not about what degree it goes up. We need to be able to address the trends without actually making this a battle of science and who has the best knowledge of the IPCC report or the newest technology. This has to move beyond that if we really want to make an impact. So definitely we need to do a lot on fake news and misinformation, but we also need to just take a little bit of a helicopter view and say, does it really matter
Right.
in the big picture? If this number or that technology is the best right now.
Really good point. Thank you so much. So panelists, I'm going to ask you to turn off your cameras for the time being. And for all of the guests, there are 2 more questions that I'm going to answer sort of verbally and give you some information before we jump into our break. First thing I want you to know is that that we're going to answer all the questions about hiring during the second half of this webinar. So if you've asked a question in the Q&A that was specific to the hiring process, don't worry, we're going to try to get to that in the second part of the event. If you've asked a question that was more related to communications, etc., we're going to post some of those responses in the follow-up email, so get ready for that. And if we are able to answer some of those questions that are more detailed, we will try to do that as well if we have time today. And one of the questions that I specifically want to target here and mention is a question from Felisa. Can you share resources for learning about the best practices and philosophies for climate communications, persuasion, and storytelling, and how that changes in the international context? So I'm going to put into the chat, I'm opening up the chat for me to communicate to all of you, a link to the One Climate Action resources page that has a couple of resources that are specific to this. Plus, there's something called the Climate Communications Hub, which just launched a couple of months ago, which also has some of these great resources that can be valuable to you. It has classes that you can take and, well, links to classes, links to reports, links to research. So I'll put those two links in the chat, which you'll be able to see in just a couple of moments. And we're going to go into a 5-minute break. We'll be back.